Not much is said in the book of Genesis about the actual covenant of circumcision. But of course that comes up too. It's repeated later on in the law of Moses. In the 17th chapter, it says that when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord, and always be conscious of the way Lord is spelled. If it's spelled with small capital letters, then in the Hebrew, behind the word is God's proper name, Yahweh. And if it is spelled with lowercase letters, it's something like we would say with Sir or something like that. It's not really intended to be a divine name. If Abraham addresses somebody and says, you are my Lord, or something on that order, it means something like master, or something on that order. But when it is spelled with small caps, it is God's name. And so God appears to Abraham and Sarah and tells them that they're to have a child. Ishmael is not to be the son of promise. He is the firstborn of Abraham, the son of Sarah, of Hagar, but he is not the one who is to inherit the promise with Abraham's children. Of course, at this point, Abraham and Sarah have no children, and when they do, Isaac is the only one that is born to them. And so all that Abraham has is to go to Isaac. It's a delicate subject, and I don't want to spend too much time, but I've always thought in the 17th chapter of Genesis and it's also in the law of Moses, and it's modern day, that circumcision is a strange religious rite, isn't it? I mean, Abraham and his sons circumcision was sort of a sign between them. I have learned in recent years that many of the people in the Near East practice circumcision. The Egyptians, for example, and the people of Moab and the Ammonites and the Bedouin that traveled in the wilderness. Circumcision was a common thing in the ancient world, though we may not know about it. At least I didn't know about it until I forgot where I was reading, but that it was a common practice in the ancient world. Apparently, the idea of circumcision is that whenever a man comes to God, he is willing to take a back seat. His masculinity is no longer is not threatened by God like it might be by others. And so apparently circumcision was on that order as a covenant sign between Abraham and then Abraham and the people, or between God and the people of Israel, of Abraham first and then of God and the people of Israel. Circumcision was a sign that God was in first place, that they would submit, that the men of Abraham would submit to the ordinances, or submit to the lordship of the God of Abraham. And it is interesting to notice that a young man was to be circumcised on the 8th day. Of course, we see that even in the New Testament. I don't know why I say even, but in the New Testament, in the case of Jesus, it's on the 8th day that he's circumcised. And there is a great deal of emphasis. The 8th day comes up more in the Old Testament than you think. And so it was in some way a sign of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. God's covenant with Abraham is set forth in the 17th chapter. We talked about it some last week, in that when animals were taken, not the birds, but other animals, like a sheep or a ram or whatever it was, a goat, was to be slaughtered, and then Abraham was to walk between the pieces. Presumably, as after he walked between the pieces after he had made the covenant with God. And so presumably the idea was, may this kind of sentence be upon me if I fail to keep the covenant that I've made with God. And so in the 17th chapter, it seems to me to be strange that circumcision would be a sign of the covenant between God and the people that he had chosen. But it was. It was with Abraham. It was instituted with Abraham. And it was later on with the people of Israel. In the 18th chapter, the account of the covenant between God and Abraham continues. It's one of the best known stories. It doesn't seem remarkable or anything in the way that it starts out. But it's in the heat of the day, and it can really get hot in the desert areas south of Jerusalem. Hebron is south of Jerusalem, and it's in that area that Abraham lived. Today, if you're in a tour group, they will not take you to Hebron. Hebron is by and large a Palestinian city. That is, the Jewish people don't live in that area, though they have encroached in the area considerably now in the area of Hebron. Still, there is so much instability. The guides don't take a tour boat or buses to Hebron, to that area. But in the heat of the day, while Abraham is in Hebron, under the tamarisk tree, apparently the word tamarisk tree was just another way of saying a tree that in some way had been declared to be sacred. And it was the ordinary name. It's an oak. Abraham stayed by the oaks of Mamre. And so while he is there, the tent is set up. It's in the heat of the day. And if you've been to the land of Israel and you see the Bedouin during the heat of the day, they roll up the tents on all sides, so that being under the tent is essentially being under a shade. The rest, the breeze blows through there, but there are no walls. And so Abraham is in the door of his tent, which is the door of his tent would be his old tent, would be open to him. And there are three men that appear. Now, two of the three men later on go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and they are called angels. But one of the men that appears when Abraham talks to him, the leader of the three, when Abraham talks to him, he calls him Yahweh. The word, you can see it in the English translation, as I've already said. In the English translation, when Yahweh stands behind Lord, it is an indication that God's proper name, Yahweh, is being used. In the older translations, in the King James Version, the older translations, there would be a few instances where God would be called Jehovah, and that's where we get the term. And nobody knows just how the name was pronounced. You may know that in Hebrew there are no vowels, or at least the letters are not vowels. They make little crosses and such as that underneath the letters, which indicates the vowels. But in the newspapers of Jerusalem and such as that, there are no vowel pointings. The name Yahweh is spelled Yod, He, and then a Vav and a He. And they're all consonants. And so nobody knows just how to pronounce it. One way that you might pronounce it is Jehovah. But most people who study languages believe that it would be pronounced more like Yahweh in God's proper name. And so sometimes I will say Yahweh when I mean God's proper name, and you could just as well say Jehovah, because we don't really know, as I've said, we don't really know how the name was pronounced by Abraham and by the ancient people. But you see, that has to do itself with giving of the law. You are not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And the Pharisees thought, well, we'll build a hedge around the law. Maybe you've heard of that. The practice of the Pharisees was to try to build such a hedge around the law that they not only would not break the law, but they wouldn't get close enough so they could break it. And so you are not to take the name of the Lord. What the Hebrew says is Yahweh. You shall not take the name of Yahweh, your God, in vain. But and so the Pharisees, the people of Israel, really for some time, had followed the practice when they came across God's proper name, they would not try to say it. As I've already indicated, it is sort of iffy how the word was actually said. But they avoided all the problems by coming, when they came across the proper name, the Jews would say Lord. They would not say Yahweh or Jehovah or any such thing. They wouldn't try to pronounce it. They would just say Lord. And that's why we have the distinction in most of the translations. The old American Standard Version didn't follow the practice. But other than that, almost all of the translations have tried to indicate God's proper name, Yahweh, with small uppercase letters, other than the first L. And so after you said Lord, O-R-D, you can see that it is that it is small, written smaller, but written at the same time as uppercase letters. So the one man, that the main person of the three that visit the tent of Abraham, is actually called Yahweh. You can see, because sometimes Abraham will come to him and he'll say, my lords, and you can see that it is written in the normal, ordinary way we would expect Lord to be written, a master, a sir. But then there are other times when the name is spelled with small capital letters, and when it is, then that is God's proper name. Well, Abraham and Sarah have their tent set up, and they're both old people, but they have their tent set up in the area of Hebron. How large Hebron was in that day isn't clear. It might have been Abraham and Sarah might have been about the only people that lived there. Sarah dies in that region later on in the book of Genesis, and when she does, Abraham buys a field from Ephron the Hittite. And so it may be that some of the land around there was claimed by non-Israelites and some by Abraham himself. But Abraham buys a field, and in the field is a cave, and that becomes the tomb for Abraham's family. The family tomb, it somehow breaks down and when the people of Israel come into the land of Canaan under Joshua. But Abraham comes to them and he says, why don't you turn in here? Abraham says to the three, and we'll provide you some refreshments, some food for you to eat, and some water so that you can wash off your feet. In that day and time, roads were not paved, and people wore sandals. And so you walked on a dusty road for a little while and you needed your feet washed before anything else. Jesus washed the feet of the 12 on one occasion for the same reason. But Abraham invites the three and he says he thinks we will have a feast. I'll feed you whatever you need. You can rest for a while. And then after we've talked about anything that might be of common interest to us, you can go on your way. And the Bedouin out in the land of Israel, the non-Jews, the people that live in tents around the people of Israel, the Bedouin in the land of Israel today practice hospitality. Is very important to them. the students that were with me on one trip, we spent one night in a Bedouin camp. And Jan and I had one of the better places. It was where we stayed looked like a small travel trailer. But there was a big tent set up, and the fellows slept on one end of it, and the girls slept on the other end. But it was all under one roof. Under it was a big tent that the Bedouin lived in, and of course they tried to get as many of the. I don't know what they were paid for the students and Jan and I to stay there, but I'm sure they were paid something. And so for Abraham and Sarah to invite the three in for hospitality was a long-standing practice before Abraham's time, and then after Abraham's time, all the way up into our modern time. And so the three turned aside. But remember again that one of them is called, when Abraham addresses sometimes the one fella, he calls him Yahweh. But of the group generally, he says, if you will look, for example, in verse 3 of chapter 18, and he said, "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by." But if you look at the word Lord, you'll see that it's written like any other word on the page. It's not capitalized. It's at this time he doesn't know who he's dealing with, apparently, because he uses the ordinary word Adonai, which means Lord. And so he tells Sarah to make some fresh loaves of bread for the men, and he goes out to his where his animals are, and he takes one of them, a calf that is fat, fed presumably only with grain, and one of the better pieces of meat, and he gives it to his boy to slaughter and to bring refreshments to the men. And so they eat and they talk for a period of time. But as time goes along, that word Lord suddenly changed. Well, Sarah heard the three men talking with Abraham, and the one man, the leader of the group, said that Sarah was going to have a child. Well, she overheard that, and she was 90 years old, and so she said, she just laughed. He says in verse 10, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And Abraham said, "She's there in the tent." And then he said, presumably this is the one that is called Yahweh, he said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and when I return to you, Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door. They were advanced in age, it says in verse 11, past the time of childbearing, and Sarah laughed. It's somehow we know that Sarah laughed, and that that Yahweh had a pronouncement to be made. But already, back in the previous chapter, when Abraham was told that he was going to have a son, in verse 17 of chapter 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man who is 100 years old?" And so it's not only Sarah, but it's Abraham. They had been promised a child so long that apparently it was a laughing matter. They didn't think, Sarah and Abraham, that they were going to have a child. But then the three of them, the three men that had stayed with and been refreshed by Abraham and Sarah, they left. God said, the Lord said, verse 13, the Lord said, and you notice in verse 13, it is capitalized, the small capital letters. The Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, "Shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old?" And is anything too difficult for the Lord, for Yahweh? Is anything too hard for him? At the appointed time, he says, "I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." And so, in the course of the year that follows, Abraham and Sarah did have a child. He is named, Sarah wants his name changed, or his name to be Laughter. That's what Isaac means. Isaac means laughter. And so her reproach is taken away. A woman, it was always the woman's fault. I probably have said this before. But if there was a couple and they had no children, it was always because the woman was barren. Now, we know in our modern times that it may be the man who cannot bear a child or cause a child to be conceived in any given instance. But in the ancient world, it was always the woman. The woman was at fault. And so the reproach was taken away. In the case of Sarah, of course, Hagar, her handmaiden, had borne a child already by Abraham, and so they knew that Abraham could father a child. But Sarah just laughed at the very idea. And Yahweh speaks, and he says, "Do you really think that anything is too hard for Yahweh to do?" And as the three of them leave, Abraham accompanies them in the direction of Sodom. Now, the next chapter, chapter 19, is going to be the chapter what we're going to deal with next week. Is Abraham's, or Lot's rather, being with the two angels. They are called angels in chapter 19, verse 1. And so the city of Sodom is destroyed. But before it is destroyed, Abraham has this interesting conversation with the one who is called Yahweh. And on the way, God says, or Abraham speaks first, and he said, "Will you destroy the righteous in Sodom along with the wicked?" And he says, "Well, if there are 50 righteous people," he says, "I will look." And Yahweh acts as if he has come down to know about Sodom, to find out things about Sodom that he could not have found out other than a personal visit. And so he says to Abraham, "I won't destroy the city if there are 40. Well, Abraham starts thinking about it, and he says, "Well, suppose that there are 10 short of the 50. Suppose there are 40. If there are 40 righteous people in the city, would you destroy everything?" And so God says, "If there are 40, I will not." And you can see the direction of the story. It finally comes down to 10. And Yahweh says, "I'll not destroy it if there are 10 righteous in the city." And so Sodom was really a bad place. There were plenty of wickedness and immorality. And of course, with the story of Sodom, we find the descendants of Lot, and we find out where the Ammonite and the Moabite people come from, descended from Lot. So we get an insight into the family at that time. Of course, Esau remains unborn. Esau is the offspring of Isaac, and Eliezer of Damascus is going to travel back to Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac. I can remember very well a teacher that I had years ago. I can remember what he said here. It says when Rebecca was introduced to the family, it says she became his wife of Isaac. She became the wife of Isaac, and Isaac loved her. Sometimes love isn't something that is the cause of a match, but it's the result by long years of staying together. I think it is. I've tried to illustrate the same point several times with a child. I have known of instances where a woman was so anxious to have a child, but when the child was born, it was like it was all over, and she didn't want anything to do with the child for a while. But after changing the diapers and feeding it and being with the child, it grows on you. It's like that with anything. You serve somebody or something, and you come to feel emotionally attached. And so the love between Isaac and Rebekah was not only a matter of physical beauty, of eyesight, but they got married, they were one, and then Isaac came to love her, and she came, I'm sure, to love him. It is often that way with a good marriage. Well, we will study about Sodom and Gomorrah next week. I think it is an interesting story. It's a terrible story in a lot of ways, but interesting in others. Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom especially, comes up many times in the course of the New Testament, as much as any other thing from the Old Testament. So thank you for your attention. I've enjoyed being with you today, and we'll count on being together this time next week.